Podcast Playlist.
You are listening to Podcast Playlist, a podcast about podcasts, where I, Brendan Hutchins, share what I've been listening to and why you should listen too. I'm a home remodeler from Portland, Oregon, and I listen to podcasts almost all day, every day.
The investigation into possible links between...
Are there tapes of the president's conversations with James?
Saying that we don't cover terrorism, that's just false.
Senate Republicans finally unveiled a draft of their health care bill today.
Is under investigation for obstruction of justice. But of course...
Years ago, I used to listen to news and politics podcasts often, trying to stay informed and learn about the world. After a while, it became overwhelming, and I felt weighed down by all of the suffering. I had to stop. From the beginning of the 2016 presidential primaries, I felt I needed to return to current events so I could cast an educated vote. So I started listening to a variety of sources to become informed and stay on top of the candidates, policies, and perspectives. I learned a lot during that time. Over the year-and-a-half-long journey, I sampled over 50 different news and politics podcasts. Many parroted the week's news and gave surface-level analysis at best, but others presented themselves as well-researched, contextually aware, and deeply analytical. These were podcasts I found myself looking forward to each week. And now we're here. Whether you're watching a comedy, listening to radio, scrolling through Facebook, or overhearing a conversation between friends at the coffee shop, it's nearly impossible to escape the chaotic, overwhelming, and constant drum of real news, fake news, alternative facts, biased commentators, and elitism. As of June 2017, the top 5 audio and video news and politics podcasts on the Apple podcast charts are MSNBC's Rachel Maddow, Fox's News Flash, NPR's Up First, the New York Times' The Daily, and Crooked Media's Pod Save America. It's pretty interesting that those podcasts represent the liberal media, conservative media, the establishment media, and the independent new media. Out of hundreds of podcasts just devoted to news, which shows have quality reporting and perspectives? Which shows are enjoyable to listen to? Which shows are worth your time? I have listened to all the top shows and many of the non-top shows, and I have some suggestions of which podcasts to listen to for quality news and analysis, verifiable information, pleasant presentation, and concise delivery so you can stay informed without wasting time. This is the beginning of my series on news and politics podcasts. This episode will focus on FiveThirtyEight Politics podcast by FiveThirtyEight.com that started in January 2016 to analyze data during the United States presidential primaries. They planned to stop after the election, but they've continued to discuss opinion polls and other sets of public data regarding the new administration's policies and current events. 538 is hosted by a quality team of journalists and analysts. Host Nate Silver, a political and sports analyst, is the creator of 538.com.
But the point is that, people, I think people, in a weird way, underestimate how bad midterms usually are for, so people are like, well, they'll write these takey things. They'll be like, well, Democrats might actually have a shot at winning the House. It's like, well, no S-town, Sherlock, right? I mean, of course they have a shot.
Zeitgeisty turn of phrase.
There are enough Democrats in districts that Hillary Clinton won to make the House 50-50, basically. And so, even if Trump were fairly popular, there's risk to a party in the midterms. When you have a president with a 40% approval rating now, there's a lot of vulnerability for Republicans. If you didn't have the gerrymandering and the districting problems that Democrats have, which are huge problems for them, then we'd be talking about, can they win 50 seats? With those problems, it might be, can they win 25 seats? Mm-hmm. And so you kind of cut that in half. But people are being a little bit too conservative about, midterms are bad in cases like this almost every time for the president's party.
Nate became well known after he correctly predicted 49 out of the 50 states in the 2008 presidential election and all 50 states plus D.C. in the 2012 election, using an analysis method he created to examine and weigh polls and statistics. For the 2016 presidential election, 538 predicted 45 states plus D.C. correctly. They expected Hillary would win the election, but they had a higher chance that Trump would win than any other major forecaster. 538 is often viewed as liberal, even though they just analyze data, and they were ridiculed by the left for predicting such a high likelihood of a Republican win. I'll have a link in the show notes to a BuzzFeed article that compared all the major prediction outlets illustrating how 538 was the most accurate. And just a warning, there's a lot of math.
I'm a seller on internal polls. I think that public pollsters have incentives to be accurate and that private pollsters have very conflicted incentives. Anytime you're in an organization, think about the place that you work, and you're asked to provide a self-assessment. It's actually a very complicated thing, right? It's a very political thing, and it might not be as honest as if you bring in, God knows, McKinsey or something, even though they know you less well, right? And they have missing all types of information that you have. But, I actually think that one of the big undercovered stories of the campaign is how kind of national political reporters bought the Clinton campaign's polls as gospel, ignored whatever the Trump campaign had to say, ignored private poll or public polls, and in our view, showed a pretty tight race at the end. And so I hope people are not on this bandwagon as much.
Nate is joined by Claire Malone, a senior political writer formerly on the editorial staff of The New Yorker, whose writing has also appeared in The New York Times and Vice.
I do think that this fellow Mike Pence, Vice President Pence, is someone we should be talking more about.
Pence is also playing the personal politics of power much better. There's this book I can't remember, I think it's The Rules of Power, that's like really popular in prisons, where it's about like how you should behave in deference to your boss in order to rise. And it is always about being, if you're like a middleman, if you're a middle person. I think ostensibly this book was written about for business, but it's popular in prisons and gang culture. But it's like the idea that you should be, in order to gain power as a subordinate, you should always be deferential to your boss. You should always deflect attention to your boss. Praise should be given to your boss. Bannon became a media phenom in his own right. Mike Pence, his great line of, "I'm a conservative, but I'm not angry about it," is just like quietly collecting power. I mean, the guy's in Korea, in the DMZ right now. Like he's kind of making moves. He's like, his abortion, anti-abortion agenda is sort of pushing through. Like, and he's behaving in the way that you're supposed to if you want to gain power with a person who has a very hierarchical view of the world.
Harry, get in here. I do just want to commend Claire for saying Pence is playing the politics of personal political power.
And by WizKid Harry Enton, a senior political writer and analyst whose writing has appeared in The Guardian and is known for his analytical skills and quick wit.
So there are two stories. Number one, the Democrats had no idea what was coming. I've heard this from multiple sources that the Democratic polls in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, they had Clinton ahead in all three states. However, the Republican polls were far closer to the truth. They, in fact, had a very tight race, perhaps one in which Clinton was a favorite, but a very slight favorite, maybe 55% chance to win the election. So I think this is an example of sometimes internal polls do a very good job of pegging the race where it's going to be, but sometimes their data is just as bad as everybody else's.
These three are guided from topic to discussion by host and producer Jody Evergan, previously a producer and reporter at WNYC and NPR, where he worked on the Media for Economics and Radiolab. Jody provides structure, flow, and occasionally plays devil's advocate when the rest of the panel is in agreement.
Okay, let's get into a bit of what we're going to do this week, but I want to start with actually a new game that we're going to introduce. We'll see how this goes. So I have found it helpful throughout this year when we've had conversations about the various Trump scandals to try and tease apart what feels like smoke and what feels like fire. That's been the framing. So I figured we could frame an actual game around that, if you will, called Trump Scandal Smoke versus Fire. Here's how it's going to work. I am going to mention a scandal, and we'll go around the table and just briefly tell us if you think that it is mostly smoke or mostly fire. We're not going to get to the bottom of this mystery. It's not S-Town here, folks. We're just going to explore and see what we find. So let's start with this. Smoke versus fire. Devin Nunes. There were allegations that the White House fed information to House Intelligence Chair Devin Nunes, which allowed him to give that press conference, kind of giving cover, but not really. It's kind of like fake cover to Trump's allegations that he was being surveilled by the Obama administration. So we don't have to go all the way back to these unproven charges by Trump, but Devin Nunes himself, what part of this whole very confusing, swirling scandal, Nate, feels like legit there's something here, or is it all swirling smoke to you?
I mean, I know when people mention Devin Nunes, I want to change the channel. Given how much news there is, I mean, he's been acting like an idiot.
But that's the point, isn't it? To me, I think it's like they're purposely poisoning the well of this investigation, and Nunes is sort of like either in on it or like a useful ploy in this whole plan to be like, what was Nunes doing? Like, what happened? And like people breaking this news about him running around without staff and going to the White House. And meanwhile, now they don't have like a legit investigation in the House.
Into the Russia
But
stuff.
can they, this is one case where the polling's relatively unambiguous. The public would want an investigation. And I don't understand what Nunes is supposed to be accomplishing for anyone. And it also seems like in the immediate term, it's not as substantive as the policy stories that are going on or the Russia story itself.
Harry, how do you think about this?
I think of it as smoke in terms of the overall investigation. I don't think that this thing has very much to do with what the eventual outcome will be. I do think it's fire insofar as believing that I'm not going to expect anything from the House.
In addition to the weekly 15-minute podcast that usually drops on Mondays, the 538 team sometimes records an emergency podcast to provide more timely analysis of current news. These are often about 30 minutes and focus on a single topic. For instance, just after Neil Gorsuch was nominated to the Supreme Court, 538 put out an emergency podcast on the topic of appointing a new judge to the Supreme Court, how Merrick Garland wasn't allowed to have hearings, and what credentials Neil Gorsuch has for the position. More recently, with the news about memos left by former FBI Director James Comey, 538 held another emergency podcast to discuss what was known about why he was fired and where we go from here. And now with the constant stream of revelations coming out of the White House, it's almost like they're a twice-the-weekly podcast.
Welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. My name is Jody Avirgan. I guess it's an emergency podcast, but at this point, should we just be putting standing calendar invitations on our...
We're under martial law here at the 538 office due to continued state of Trump emergency.
Yes, the emergencies do keep piling up, but here we are to talk about the latest one, which I will recap in a sec. But here joining us is Editor-in-Chief Nate Silver. Hello, Nate.
Hey, Jody.
And Claire Malone. Hello, Claire.
Hi, Jody.
And WizKid Harry Anthony is not with us because this morning, it's about 11 o'clock on Wednesday, he is in Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway, embedded. But we're here to talk about this. And again, it is 11 o'clock on Wednesday. Who knows what things will break over the course of our conversation here. And also, we're together in Nate's office, not our usual studio, because it's a little crazy. We have to scramble for space, but here we are. So I'm not going to recap everything that's happened over the last week because it really does feel like there was one thing each day. But really the news of the moment and the focus of the moment are these reports that James Comey, former FBI director, wrote a memo in the wake of a conversation he had with Donald Trump in which Comey claims Trump asked him to back off the investigation of Michael Flynn, which is related to the investigation of the Trump campaign's connections with Russia. So, Nate, my question is simple. How big is this?
It's really big. I mean, and if we have a track record here, and I think we've often said in the podcast and in our chats and our coverage that certain events are overhyped. But I think what makes the Comey story different are a couple of things, right? Number one, we're going to keep seeing, I would assume, additional leaks about this and news and narratives and counter-narratives. Comey seems, at a minimum, determined to get his side of the story out. At a maximum, you could argue he's trying to do it in the most damaging way possible for Trump, which in the modern media environment would mean leaks that kind of are planted over the course of days and weeks and months, and then he'd probably be compelled to testify before Congress. He keeps very detailed notes. So, the combination of this being a continuous story instead of a one-off story, I mean, I think politicians can survive almost any story these days if there's no follow-up. Plus the fact that, we are right in the wheelhouse of what most scholars would agree constitute impeachable offenses.
And we'll get to that in a sec. But Claire, how big is this?
Is this a big deal? It's a big deal. I have nothing to add to that, which is, it's a big deal.
Is it a big political deal or is it a big legal
It's both. It's a big political and legal deal.
The podcast will occasionally have specials that dive deeper into a single topic that's too big to fit in a single episode. During the lead up to the election, 538 aired short audio documentaries. Topics included how Howard Dean's scream cost him the 2004 election, the connection between Obama and Reverend Wright, and lastly on how Ross Perot affected or didn't affect the 1992 election. All of these had an underlying theme of how these topics related to the 2016 election. In February of 2017, 538 wrapped a series called Party Time, where Claire and contributor Galen Druk, a producer and reporter for WNYC, NPR, and On the Media, interview leaders from different factions of the two political parties to get a feel for the direction of where the party and the country is going. The interviews consist of hosts trading back and forth with questions and follow-ups. Plus, the series illustrates there's more than one side to each side. None of the political parties have a unified vision for the future or a plan of how to get there.
Claire, Galen, so let's talk about the series that you did a little bit. So just to remind people, if they didn't hear it, you basically broke it into 4 parts, and you talked about 4 wings of the 2 major parties. So you talked about Trump Republicans, never Trump Republicans, Sanders-y Democrats, and establishment Democrats.
The 4 Party Time episodes are highly produced and easy to digest. There are some really great interviews that show how similar and different the politics and positions are between party leaders. If you were to go back and listen to any of 538's old episodes, these would hold up really well. By the time you listen to this, the Party Time and audio documentary episodes may be pushed out of the feed, but you can access their backlog of episodes on their website, 538.com/tag/politics-podcast, and the link will be in the show notes for all of these. The 538 Politics podcast is one of the best audio programs to get a few of the top stories of the week analyzed by journalists who deliver statistical-based commentary to differentiate between empirical and subjective, provide emergency episodes for a quick take on breaking news, and deepen discussions with special episodes featuring interviews and fact-checking with politicians and investigative reporters. You can find more at 538.com, and the links will be in the show notes. Political podcasts vary in their strengths and weaknesses, so I will discuss a few more in this series that take a much different approach than 538. Keep listening. Happy to say that this podcast is supported by Audible, and you can go to audibletrial.com/podcast playlist and receive your free audiobook. It's yours to keep, and you'll get 30 days access to their other features like daily deals. Nate Silver wrote the book The Signal and the Noise, available on Audible, and here's a sample.
The instinctual shortcut that we take when we have too much information is to engage with it selectively, picking out the parts we like and ignoring the remainder, making allies with those who have made the same choices and enemies of the rest. The most enthusiastic early customers of the printing press were those who used it to evangelize. Martin Luther's 95 Theses were not that radical. Similar sentiments had been debated many times over. What was revolutionary, as Elizabeth Eisenstein writes, is that Luther's theses did not stay tacked to the church door. Instead, they were reproduced at least 300,000 times by Gutenberg's printing press, a runaway hit even by modern standards.
Please visit audibletrial.com/podcast playlist to get this or any audiobook for free, and you can keep that book forever. And you'll also get access to their service for 30 days. That's audibletrial.com/podcast playlist, and the link will be in the show notes. This episode was recorded in wonderful to visit Portland, Oregon. Writing and narration by me, Brendan Hutchins. The producer and script editor was Sarah Hutchins. The chief advisor was Yuvi Zalko. And moral support and infinite distractions were provided by Sebastian and Autumn, Sarah and my cats. There are a couple ways to support the show. To keep the recommendations coming, please visit podcastplayl.ist/support. There you can find my Patreon page and other affiliate links to support the show. For more podcast recommendations and to rate and review podcasts yourself, head to podchaser.com, a new site devoted to podcast discovery. A cross between IMDb to track hosts and guests, and what Letterboxd is for movies and Goodreads is for books, Podchaser is a social home for rating and reviewing podcasts and episodes. You can use my beta key, Podplay, PODPLAY, for access to Podchaser during the beta, and a link will be in the show notes. Hey, this is a podcast. This podcast is hosted on the incredible Podient.co podcasting platform that has a free unlimited tier and upgrades for services and features. If you're looking to host your own podcast, check it out and send me a link. I'd love to hear your show. Send me your comments, suggestions, and recommendation success stories. I'm at the Pod Playlist on Twitter. I'm on Facebook at Podcast Playlist. I'll accept text or audio messages to the podcast playlist at gmail.com. You can leave a comment on the post at podcastplayl.ist, where you can also see the show notes. In the immortal words of Mike Burkett from NoFX,